So happy to be joined by Kate Steir on this episode of the Tattoo Historian Show. She is a senior curator and head of collections at Gunston Hall. And Kate, I'm so glad you had the time to come on and chat with me today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
So some people, I have a lot of American listeners because I'm born and raised in the U.S., now living in Canada, and so my platform started down there. But some people may not know what Gunston Hall is or where it's located. So could you fill us in on that, Kate?
Absolutely. So, Gunston Hall is the 18th century plantation and home of George Mason. George Mason was a constitutional framer, founding father. He's known particularly in the kind of mid Atlantic Virginia area for being the primary author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was the very first time individual rights were laid out in the North American colonies with the force of law. And a lot of those rights would then show up both in other state constitutions and in the Bill of Rights. And it's located south of Washington, D.C., in Lorton, Virginia, Fairfax County. And it was also home to between 200 and 300 enslaved people, as well as George Mason's wife. He married twice over his lifetime at Gunston Hall, and 9 children that survived to adulthood.
So what has your career trajectory been like, Kate, to get to where you are today?
Absolutely. So I have been at Gunston Hall for about 3 years now. And during that time, I also finished my PhD in Atlantic history. So that has certainly helped with my research skills, and with some of the ways I think about how we can get information, how we interpret our collections, and that sort of thing. But throughout the whole time I was doing my PhD, I have been working in museums. I've worked at small historic houses doing education. I've worked at the National Numismatics Collection at the Smithsonian, doing both education and curatorial roles. And so I have been kind of on short and part term projects, as well as doing my academic career until I really found Gunston Hall.
So what's your day-to-day life like, Kate, as a senior curator and head of collections? It's a lot of titles for me to say. I'm used to just one or
I
or so, but
absolutely.
you're wearing a lot of hats here. What's your day-to-day life like at Gunston Hall?
Yeah, and so Gunston Hall is, I would say, a mid-sized museum. We have about 20 staff. So on the collection side, and so that's our 3,000 museum artifacts, 5,000 rare books, as well as our archival collections. I am the sole full-time staff member responsible for that. And I've also taken on our public history outreach initiatives over the last year as well. So that does kind of feel like a lot of hats. I'm supported by a really wonderful part-time collections management technician. Shout out to Evie Quigley for supporting me through all of this. And I work really closely with our education department as well. Um, so there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that happens, in terms of inventorying all of our collections, making sure that we know what everything is and where it is and what state it's in, and checking for pests and all of that, those kind of day to day, making sure that all of our records have up to date research and that we kind of understand the full scope of what we have and how we can interpret that, how we can use it in exhibits, but also how we can make it accessible to researchers. So that's like one bucket of things. And then there's the sort of more public facing side of things. So over the past year, we have been working with both the Patawomic Indian Nation, as well as the Piscataway, particularly the Piscataway Kanoi band, in order to provide, really for the first time, exhibits on site that let visitors learn a little bit about the Indigenous communities that were at Gunston Hall but also at some of the other 25,000 acres that the Mason family and George Mason claimed during the 18th century. So that has been a really exciting project. And we have recently founded a Descendants Advisory Committee. So we are working with the descendants of people who were enslaved at Gunston Hall, and they are working with us on some kind of memorial reconstruction interpretive element. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like yet, in the location where our archaeologist has found the remains of a community where people were held in slavery at Gunston Hall. So those are some of the big projects, and you can see they're kind of sequenced from, very, okay, we've got to get these folders organized today to be able to do this kind of larger project that people can actually see and interact with, down the line in 6 months or a year, whatever that is.
I'd love to ask you about the indigenous stories there as far as how you plan to incorporate that into the public history side of Gunston Hall. What is the brainstorming sessions like? What's the planning like? How do you see this coming to fruition, or how do others see this coming alive for the viewing public?
Absolutely. So this project has kind of taken place over the last 2 or 3 years at this point. And one of the things that we've been really interested in at Gunston Hall is there's about 500 acres, 554, that the nonprofit Gunston Hall owns today and stewards of the original 5,000 acres that was the Gunston Hall plantation in the 18th century. And so for the Gunston Hall has been a museum about 70 years. And for a long time, that meant really the mansion. And then, as time went on, the bicentennial in the 70s, it also became some of the outbuildings, some of the landscape. But we really want to push that even further and say, okay, we have 550 acres, we have trails, we have riverfront. How can people come and engage with this whole landscape, and see it both as a natural resource and as a cultural historical resource? So that was sort of one of the impetus behind how we thought about doing this. And so we reached out to kind of any indigenous communities in the area who have ancestral homeland kind of anywhere in that 25,000 Mason family acres from the 18th century. And we, heard back from representatives of the Piscataway Conoy and the Patawomic, and they had capacity and interest to kind of work with us. And when we talked with representatives from the Piscataway Conoy, a lot of them have had really good experience doing trail signage. And so they were excited about that. And based on, their kind of previous experience and expertise, we kind of co-curated a new sign that is going in for fabrication as we speak. So it'll be visible at our trailhead in the not too distant future, talking about fishing, and the kind of historical cultural knowledge of what shadfish meant within the Piscataway, both culture, but also economy. And that's exciting in and of itself, also because it connects Gunston Hall to the Potomac. It helps to tell the story of how Piscataway people lived on both sides of the Potomac. So they're recognized by the state of Maryland. We are a Virginia site, and yet the Potomac was a highway, not a border. And the same was true for George Mason, who, even though he's really associated with Virginia, he served in the House of Burgesses, he also owned land in Maryland, and his wives were both from Maryland. And so he also saw the Potomac, which is, you can see it from Gunston Hall, as that highway, not a border, and he engaged in commercial fishing. New research that a postdoc at Southern Methodist University, Greta Swain, has done has shown the amount of fishing he engaged in, like to the order of tens of thousands of pounds. And so it helps us to kind of draw this connection with the landscape over hundreds of years to understand how these natural resources and also these animals changed the way that all of these different people who lived at Gunston Hall interacted with the land and how they thought about ownership and resources and some of these things that show up as protections in the Virginia Declaration of Rights.
So you're really also touching on environmental history in that way,
Absolutely.
and a lot of places, or a lot of visitors, I should say, don't think about that when they go to places like that, other than, oh, there's a trail here, but they don't think about the environmental history behind, maybe that trail has been there for thousands of years and used by indigenous peoples, or maybe they fished in this area and now someone else is doing the same thing for a profit. That's a really interesting interdisciplinarity that a lot of visitors tend to either look over, or they think it's a different kind of history, and you're blending those two together.
Absolutely. And we've been working on that in a number of different ways. In 2022, we opened a restored 18th century garden. So this is based on like 20 years of archaeology, um, looking at the landscape that was the Gunston Hall formal gardens and looking at ungerminated seeds to figure out what plants were in different areas. And that has been really fascinating because a lot of visitors have been asking questions like, okay, is this going to be a native garden? Is this going to be pollinators? Is this? And the 18th century style was a very formal garden. It was essentially part of the house. The garden pathways are mathematically designed so the central pathway is the exact same width as the central hallway of the house, which is the exact same width as the carriage approach. And so this idea of a natural landscape would have been so unappealing to George Mason. He had people that he enslaved terrace the hillside in the back behind the garden in a way that took, engineers, as we were working to recreate that, it was mathematically so challenging and altered the scope so that he could see the Potomac and be at the correct angle to the Potomac. And so I think that's been really interesting too, to be able to interpret the way that George Mason related to the landscape is really different than what a lot of our visitors see when they come, and the way that they think about the environment and what is natural. So that's been really fun to talk about as well.
You brought up the Descendants Advisory Board, and I would love to hear more about what that is and what you hope to gain from that experience with the descendants of enslaved persons there.
Absolutely. So we are just getting that off the ground. It officially formed January 1st. So we're getting ready to kind of gear up for some meetings. And the initial way that we are conceptualizing this, and this has been also after about a year of meeting informally with most of the people that we ended up asking to be on this group and getting a sense of how they are already related to Gunston Hall. A lot of them are our neighbors who still live very close, who've had family members who even more recently have worked for the museum or who worked for the private owners after the Masons. And so that's helped us understand the way that these connections have been ongoing. And also to know, how are families already coming to visit? What would they like to see more of? What do they want to do? And that's allowed us to settle on, over the next 2 years, leading us into 2026, to the 250th anniversary of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. That's, I think, the most important document that was ratified in
That's the only
17.
one I've heard of, right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
my understanding.
Yeah.
In that time, we would like to, first of all, have a new interpretive plan. I mentioned that I work really closely with our education department. And so we want to collaborate and have this sense of what are the big important themes that are guiding the stories that we're telling? How are they related to questions of rights? How can we talk about George Mason's legacy further into the future after his death? So these kinds of things. And to create that overarching document, we'd like to get feedback from our descendants, both as descendants and as people who are frequent visitors and members of our community. So that's one area we're hoping to work with them. And in working on this, again, this interpretive experience where our archaeologist identified these cabins that we believe were occupied by people who were enslaved at Gunston Hall. And that's been really helpful. Already there are oral histories within these families that have helped us kind of learn a little bit more about the landscape, think about how people used space differently. It's also helped me go back to some of the founding documents of the museum and see that, these early members of our Board of Regents, who are members of the National Society of the Colonial Dames. So we also have that legacy. We've had really close connections with people descended from George Mason. And so this is an opportunity to add on and build on those really wonderful, powerful connections we already have. And I saw that, back in the 1950s, actually a lot of these dames were working really closely with these descendant families to learn information. And so in some ways we're returning actually to that model in a little bit of a different way. So that's been kind of really exciting to learn a little bit of that history as well. And the idea is that once those sort of projects are completed, we'll have created knowledge among our descendants about what we do, what museum work is. A lot of people we've talked to have been like, I want to get involved, but I don't really know what is the process of creating a sign? What is the process of leading a tour? What are all those behind the scenes? How many folders and how do you clean these objects that will help us to plan something else? So the idea that after 2 years, they'll have a sense of how we work and can think about going forward. Is this going to be sort of ongoing in the sense that we've created it now? Will there be maybe a volunteer group that is similar to what we have for Mason descendants? I mean, we can kind of work on what that relationship will look like, but we're hoping that this is the beginning of sort of a permanent ongoing relationship that we can create together, which is, again, very similar to how we work with the Mason family descendants and our dames as well.
Have those who are on this board or who will be on the board or others who've come from the local area uh, who have been descended from those who were enslaved, have they given like any kind of informal advice if they don't know how to maybe do a sign in a public history sense? Do you get some kind of input from them regardless, where they're like, "Hey, I have this story, and it'd be really interesting if you just took it and ran with it," or how can you help me tell this story? Before the advisory came about, was there any kind of that going back and forth where you had that line of communication?
Absolutely. So a lot of the people that we're working with about 10 or 15 years ago were involved in a sort of semi-formal Black history program that Gunston Hall put on for many years. And a lot of that was not related to the 18th century. It was about sort of the Civil War era and immediately post-emancipation. But so that also meant that we had a really great community of people who were already sort of researchers and scholars who were coming forward and already had a really great sense of how to kind of gather family information and how to speak to older members of their family to elicit these really wonderful stories. So that groundwork, these community members were already doing that, which is amazing, and they've been very generous about kind of sharing that. And at the same time, one of the conversations that I have had with a lot of our descendants is that, we are constantly in this state of generational change, and really wanting to make sure that the stories of family members are marked and celebrated, and especially that older generations, might have the sense to see that publicly in a way that maybe when they were younger, they didn't really feel as part of the conversation, or they, didn't feel like they could speak about in such a public way. If that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I've witnessed that over the years in the public history sphere of those who felt like they were on the outside and couldn't get in, but still wanted to have input, and say, hey, I think maybe this would be an interesting way to go with this story, or hey, I have experience talking about this. And then it took a while for some sort of like an advisory counsel to come along, and then sometimes you hear the horror stories about people with advisory councils, and then they're like, well, they don't know how to treat each other
Mhm.
or respect each other. But it seems like that sense of community is already there. It was just a formality to get this advisory underway, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And just to kind of also set, like, make it clear that people that we were inviting in felt like they knew what they were being asked to do,
Mm-hmm.
and felt like they knew what they were signing up for. And also to get a sense, many of our advisory members already have ideas of what they want the sort of next projects to be. Thinking about other opportunities for signage, thinking about wanting to get maybe younger community members involved with doing special tours or marking days that are important to the community with a special program or an activity or something like that. So these are also the conversations that we're having about, like, all right, beyond the kind of scope of these, how can we fold in things that are going to be meaningful to our visitors and our community and our descendants?
So throughout your time, uh, not just at Gunston Hall, but anywhere, working in the field, Kate, what has been one of your biggest challenges that you've faced coming into the field or working within the field? What do you think something that it is that pops in your head when I ask you that question? Like, what's the first thing that pops in your head?
Um, I mean, I kind of think there's, I guess, two ways that I think about that. One is a very sort of practical in terms of being in the field as a professional, which is there's a big gigification, I think, in museum work in the same way that there is in a lot of fields. And, I in some ways was quite lucky that I was able to do a lot of the kind of short term and contract work and project based and grant based roles while I was working on my PhD. And so I had that kind of stability. And by the time I was finished with my dissertation, kind of had that experience to be able to step into a permanent role. But sometimes I look at some of my younger colleagues and I do worry about the loss for the field as a whole of really energetic, interesting young professionals because they need insurance and have to take other types of work. So that's one area that, just kind of in a macro sense,
Mhm.
I am concerned about. Absolutely. Um, Within the field, I think one of the things that is both an opportunity and a challenge is, um, especially for people in kind of like the curatorial research education roles, is to keep the lines of communication with our colleagues both on the kind of administrative side of museums, so that I may not know a whole lot about what our finance department does, but the more that I know and the more that they understand what I do, kind of the better we can both work. And similarly, having finished a PhD program, like I've referenced, I think, in this conversation, research that I see that academics are doing that helps me understand what's going on or what happened in the past at Gunston Hall in new ways. And at the same time, I am not an academic. It's not going to help me that much. It's not going to help our visitors that much for me to, publish several articles that they're probably not going to find um, that readable or accessible. But building ways that we can rely on each other rather than being sort of separate professions, I think is going to be really to the benefit of everyone who cares about history and the past.
Do you have any moments in your work, Kate, that stand out to you as far as being really impactful to you personally? Something that surprised you, or an object that you found hidden in a box somewhere, and you're like, "Oh, this is interesting," or something that you've seen or heard along the way that's really been impactful to you personally or to your work?
Yeah. Um, oh goodness, that's such a good question. I can think of a couple of different answers to it. Um,
I always say I have no gotcha questions, but
yeah, no, I know.
sometimes I ask it, and it's like this one might take a moment to think about, but maybe there's more than one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess one thing, oh man, I might have to give you two answers and you can add it
You
together and
can,
pick one if you.
yep, you can give me two. That's fine.
Um, one was one of the figures that is really important to our stories at Gunston Hall is William Buckland, and he was an indentured servant who designed the interior of the house. For people who are really interested in decorative arts and design, he's kind of a big figure in the 18th century. Um, and I come from kind of a social history background. I'm really interested in what did it mean to be an indentured servant, and how did he fit in and relate to the Mason family, and how did he fit in and relate to other indentured servants, and were there enslaved people working with him? And I was doing an objects out of storage, and I was going through some of his design books, and I hadn't really intended to do this, but someone asked a question, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, these design books, now that you've raised this point, are really helping me understand what it meant to be a literate indentured servant and how that allowed someone to move in different ways and understand the limited rights that they had in the court system, and also allowed them, once they left indentured servitude, to perhaps move into different types of work because they were able to grow their skills in ways that people without literacy might have been relying on really narrow recommendations that they couldn't read or edit or know what was being said. And it was really sort of amazing to feel like I had made this kind of micro discovery alongside a visitor who was asking me questions about this book object. So that was one that just really spoke to what I love about this work and what I love about working with the public around objects. Um, so that one springs to mind. Another sort of moment recently that has been very exciting, I think I mentioned Dr. Greta Swain at Southern Methodist University. She had done a lot of her dissertation work in our archive, and it would be really wonderful to kind of work with her, making sure that archival material was accessible and that kind of thing. Um, and I was chatting with her after her dissertation was published to ProQuest. And she sort of made this comment like, oh, that was a great story I found in the archive about this man, Dick, who ran away from Gunston Hall. And I was like, yes, we talk about his story a lot because there's all these ads that George Mason placed to recover him. He left Gunston Hall twice. He's one of these figures that, we know he combed back his hair and he played the drums. And it's, rare to get that kind of detail about someone. And she was like, yeah. And it was so great to hear that, to find out that he, lived happily ever after he left in Maryland. And I was gobsmacked because my understanding was we never knew what happened. And she was talking about how she put together all of these archival pieces about him to find this alias he had been living under for part of the time, the first time he left Gunston Hall. He was living under the name Thomas Webster, which was a ship that George Mason had sort of contracted him out to work on. And she managed to find him in the census in the 1790s as the head of household, living near actually the plantation owned by George Mason's wife. So presumably maybe near family members. And that was something that I had not known would be possible to recover from the archive. So that was a really, really wonderful moment recently.
Wow. That's why I love the archive so much. You never know what you're going to find and stumble upon, and how that can connect you with another researcher
Yeah.
is incredible. That's one of the things I love about this whole field. How can the public get involved, Kate, with either coming to Gunston Hall, being volunteering, being a part of it? How do people become aware of what they can do and see at Gunston Hall?
Absolutely. So we have a website. Please check us out at gunstonhall.org. We have social media as well. So, we'd love to welcome anyone who wants to come visit us at Gunston Hall in Lorton, Virginia. We're open to the public every day except for Wednesdays. And I think like Christmas Day and New Year's Day. So pretty available. And then we do have the opportunity to apply to be a volunteer on our website. We're always kind of open to volunteers. And we're relaunching our website. And we're hoping to be publishing an Omeka site with some of our digitized artifacts and some of our archival materials very soon. So it's an exciting time to get involved with Gunston Hall. There's going to be a lot more resources, even for our kind of remote friends and family. So
Awesome. Well, I know that I come down and visit family for Christmas and the holidays. I might have to stop around other than Christmas Day, obviously,
yeah,
to hang out at
absolutely.
Gunston Hall and to link up and maybe get a couple videos around the place if it's not too chilly. So,
Yeah.
Kate, thank you so much for your time and for coming on the podcast to talk about Gunston Hall and your experience. It was great to have you on.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was a great conversation.